Hello and welcome to the introduction to Metaphysics of Mind. This module is slightly different from the other ones that we've done in that really there's kind of one central question which we're working through. That does mean that we're actually kind of unpicking a lot of stuff as we go along. So while there's one big overarching question which we haven't necessarily seen before, it's been broken down to subcategories and sub-questions. This one really puts a particular debate front and centre. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be lots of smaller debates and discussions going on, and it means that there's a lot of concepts being thrown around and theories thrown around and things. But the purpose of this video is going to be slightly different to some of the other introduction videos that we've done as well. So I'll hopefully be able to explain that on the next slide. But keep in mind with this one, I'm not necessarily presenting you with any big theories. I'm not necessarily presenting you with kind of like a starting argument. We'll just be thinking gradually about building up slowly so that we understand the content. I think the biggest problem that students face when they're discussing this metaphysics of mind content is that they struggle sometimes seeing how it fits together. They struggle sometimes trying to see how it is that they can piece things together to make essays. And sometimes they just wonder what the overall point is. So I think the main thing that I want to do just in this video is give you an understanding of what we actually mean by metaphysics of mind, what kinds of things we'll be discussing in the module, and how we can set ourselves up to understand the topic. Really, I'm not going to give you anything big, like I say, kind of like, here's the first big theory or here's the first big argument. I just want to gradually work through some pretty basic stuff and some introductory stuff, mainly to just frame the question in a particular way, so that when we start looking at these philosophical theories and arguments, we can point immediately to different things and kind of say, okay, well, how do we approach this? How do we approach that? What kind of concepts can we use? So this video may not contain loads of material which you're going to write big extended essays on, but it will be like the fundamental basic concepts and ideas that I want you to make reference to when we're making points as we go along. So I guess the main thing is to give you an idea of what we mean by metaphysics, and then wonder what we mean by metaphysics of mind. Metaphysics, if you look it up on the internet, even if you look it up in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it sort of says, well, it's kind of difficult to explain what metaphysics means. Nobody's ever sat down and really defined it. It's more a term that we've used over the past few thousand years, and it's kind of got a life of its own. But we all kind of know what we mean when we say metaphysics, but none of us can necessarily point to it. The best way that I think that you could understand what we mean by metaphysics is that it's accounts of the first principles of things, so the most basic principles, underlying principles of things, of first causes, so the initial first things that bring everything else into being, and or the underlying nature of things, kind of like the stuff that goes even beyond physics. So you could ask questions about, what is the nature of reality? What is God? Kind of like what kind of thing is God? Are there such things as moral properties? That's a metaphysical question. Remember, Kant wrote the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. So he was talking about laying the groundwork to provide an account of the first principles of morality, those basic ideas of morality. And what is the mind, which is effectively what we're looking at. So what we're looking at is investigating the metaphysics of mind, the first principles, the first causes, the underlying nature of mind itself. But in order to do that, we need to what's sometimes called delineate, that is, identify and draw clear boundaries for which things are specifically mental. So which things count as bits of the mind and which bits don't. John Searle uses a handy phrase for this. He uses the phrase, the mark of the mental. So if you think about yourself, and we're going to be doing this a little bit as we go through the video, when you're thinking about yourself, you could possibly divide yourself into those bits that you think are physical, that is the foot, or your hands or something like that. And then you could divide those things yourself into things that are mental. So you might say things like your thoughts or your feelings. And what we're really interested in is, okay, well, you've said that some of those things are clearly mental rather than physical. What is it that makes your thoughts mental rather than making them like your foot, which is physical. This is going to be really a starting point, kind of a jumping off point for us, because the first thing we've got to do is actually identify the thing that we want to talk about. And then we can get down to, once we've decided what it is that we want to talk about, we can start thinking about its underlying nature. So let's use our first bit of terminology that's going to crop up. And it's actually something that doesn't necessarily crop up until later in the course, really, but we could probably introduce it here. The point is that when we're trying to work out what we're referring to when we are talking about the mind, we have probably already got a very rough, common sense, everyday view of what the mind is. But here's a simple way to think about it. When I said to you, you know, imagine dividing yourself into two parts, the parts that are physical and the parts that are mental. You already had a rough idea of what I was talking about. That wouldn't seem like a particularly difficult task for you to some degree. The thing is, though, that means that you've already got a rough idea of what you think your mind is. And so why do we need philosophy? Why do we need all this sort of stuff? Well, the stuff that we're talking about here is what we call folk psychology. So folk psychology is the name that we give to our common sense view of the human mind, our everyday explanation of what the human mind is like. So let's have a think about some typical things which I imagine most of you will believe, if not all of you will believe, about human psychology and the mind. One, you have private mental states. That is that nobody can see your mental states. That's one thing. But you can see your mental states. You can inspect your mental states via what we would call technically introspection. That is, that's you focusing your attention on your own mental states rather than focusing your attention outside onto physical objects in the world. Okay, so it's kind of like you paying attention to your own thoughts and feelings. Now, those private mental states include, and this is not an exhaustive list, you've got thoughts, you've got feelings, memories, beliefs, sensations, hopes, desires. There's loads of other stuff. Your mental life includes dreams, the imagination. So you've got all this sort of stuff going on in your mind. Now, your mental states have got the ability to cause other mental states. So, for example, you might remember a holiday you went on and then you get a feeling of nostalgia, right? But also your mental states cause behavior. If you have a feeling of pain, that causes you to retract your hand away from the thing that's caused the pain. Or if you have a feeling of being hungry, that causes you to get up and go and get some food. And human behavior can be explained in terms of those internal mental states. So if I want to give an account of why someone's acting the way that they are, I make reference to those internal private mental states they have. And likewise, I can make predictions about their behavior, which will make reference to those internal mental states that they have. I know how people will behave in the future. This is the most basic common sense view of the mind that we've got. So let's start with folk psychology and just nudge it up a little bit in difficulty. Now, this is only moderately more difficult, right? So let's take all that folk psychology stuff that we were talking about. And let's say, for example, that some of the things that we were making reference to there, so I was saying you have thoughts, you have beliefs, and all those sorts of things, we'll put those into the category of cognition. So your mind contains this stuff, which is cognitive. So you have cognitive mental states. We'll think about what we mean by a mental state in a bit, but you know that you have these things which we'll categorize as cognitive mental states: belief, memory, perception. Those are three examples that we've got there. Your beliefs, memories that you have, and your perceptions also count as forms of cognition. That is, things to do with your beliefs and your understanding of the world around you. We also have emotions, and these things are not clear-cut. So, for example, there will be a lot of psychologists that say that emotion is not completely divorced from cognition because your emotions are kind of triggered by your beliefs and your perceptions, but there will be a cognitive element to them. But your emotions, obviously, kind of like feelings of happiness or sadness or fear, or hope, maybe a feeling of hope. So you've got these different sides to you, the cognitive and the emotional. What you've also got, psychology students will tell you, is you've got your cognitive, your emotional, and you've also got your behavioural. You exhibit certain behaviours in response to your cognition and your emotion, and that is in response to, as well, sensory inputs. Now, inside of you, there are various ways in which sensory inputs, kind of informational inputs from your environment, then get processed to lead to various outputs. So think of yourself being like a machine in many respects, that we put input into the machine. So that could be something like you seeing a picture of something, you seeing a picture of a beach somewhere, and that changes your internal state. There's a physical change to your state. That is, your eye has received some light and it's sending signals to your brain and whatever, and that pings up cognition. You recognize the thing that's in the picture, and you kind of see that it's a beach that you went to when you're a kid. You then get emotional responses. You feel a bit kind of happy remembering that. You feel a little bit nostalgic thinking about that, and then that leads you to have certain kinds of behaviors. And in between those inputs and those various kinds of outputs, the belief that kind of emerges from it, or the memory that emerges from it, the emotion that emerges from it, the behaviour which emerges from it, like you saying out loud, I remember that beach in the picture. There are these things in the middle called functions. So inside of you, there are various functions which turn inputs into outputs. So all we've done is we've taken folk psychology and we've made it a little bit more technical. We've got cognition, we've got emotion, we've got behaviour, we've got these sensory inputs, and we've got the functions that act as causal roles between the inputs and the outputs. That is complicating it just slightly more. It's making it a little bit more technical, but that is going to be building up to a lot of the discussions and debates that we're going to be having later on. So we've started off with an idea of folk psychology, that common sense view of the mind we've got. And we said, well, maybe we need to complicate that a little bit, because we can't just use our common sense understanding of the mind. We probably need a bit more than that, don't we? We're now at a stage where we can introduce the philosophical side of things, which is the mind-body problem. What is the relationship between our physical states and our mental states? So to begin with, what do we mean by physical states and mental states? Well, firstly, a state is the present manner or condition of something. So currently you are in some form of state. Now you are in some sort of physical state. That is, you will have behavioural states. Behavioural states might be things like waving, smiling, shouting, whatever it might be, jumping up and down, sitting down. You also have what we call brain states. So your brain will be doing certain things. So there might be activity in your amygdala, for example. Your C fibres might be firing. That's something you're going to hear a lot of philosophers talking about. Your brain might currently be releasing endorphins. There's, kind of various parts of your brain now kind of secreting various neurotransmitters and things like that around your brain. So your brain is currently in a particular state. There's also other physical states that you should think about, things like your heart rate, things like your breathing, all that sort of stuff. So those are the physical states that are relative to us. Obviously, other objects have different physical states to us, but those are the key ones that we're talking about. Now, you could also say that you have mental states. So mentally, you are in a particular condition, or there is a present manner in which your mind is in. So it could be in a particular cognitive state. What is it that you're believing? What is it that you're perceiving? So you're believing that something is dangerous, or you're perceiving something yellow. You might be feeling something, like you might be feeling the sensation of pain. And then there's also, to just change that up a little bit, you've got the emotional side of things, like feeling happy. So again, there might be some overlap. There might be a cognitive element to feeling happy as well. There might be emotions kind of seeping into the kind of cognitive side of your mind, kind of accompanying your cognitive states. But there we go. We've got physical states and we've got mental states. Okay. I've put an arrow kind of pinging off that just to say, well, philosophically speaking, we're interested also in functional states. So what processes are currently being carried out by the physical and the mental side of you? So when we think about the functional states, what we're talking about is the state that you're in, which is taking those various inputs and then converting them into various forms of outputs and playing a causal role between them. So if I was talking about the kind of the functional state that's involved in memory, I would be thinking about the causal processes that are actually being carried out within the system that is you. Okay, now that means that when I'm talking about this from a philosophical perspective, we're talking about what we call the mind-body problem. What is the relationship between our physical states and our mental states? And the reason that's a problem is because it's this huge question that philosophers have tackled for a very long time. We've got this thing called the mind, we've got this thing called the body, and we're not necessarily 100% sure how it is that the physical and the mental interact, whether the physical is able to interact with the mental, whether the mental is able to interact with the physical, and even like whether or not the mental could just be a form of the physical, or whether or not it is something completely separate from the physical. These are all possible answers, but this again is just us moving a little bit closer to understanding some of these key questions. We're still just trying to work out at this stage exactly what features we think the mind actually has, so we can start to answer some of those big questions like the mind-body problem. So now is the point where I'm going to have to apologise, because we're going to get a little bit technical. We've built up slowly folk psychology, our common sense everyday view. We then got a bit more psychological. We started talking about cognition and emotion. We then introduced the mind-body problem, and we started talking about the relationship between mental states and physical states. Now we're going to use the terminology that's used by David Chalmers, who's one of the big philosophers that we're going to talk about when we look at this actual debate. In the opening chapter of a book called The Conscious Mind, which is one of David Chalmers' famous books, he presents what he calls the idea that mental terms have what he calls a double life. That is, he says, there's the psychological life of a mental term. So mental term, he means like the words that we use for things like memory or fear or thought or whatever it might be. So he says that on the one hand, there's the psychological account that we give. And he says to give a psychological account is just to discuss the appropriate causal roles involved in the mental states that we have. So, for example, we might discuss things like the role of our central nervous system in the fight or flight response, right? We might talk about the way in which the brain develops and moves around electrical signals to create our perceptions. But then we could also talk about, because one of the things that we haven't mentioned here is if I'm talking about fear in a psychological sense, what I will be saying is, well, fear is the thing which kind of triggers us into reacting to dangerous stimuli in the following way, blah, 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 blah. So mental terms can fit into those discussions just by playing a particular role in trying to explain the way that we respond to stimuli and the way that we act, for example. Now, he then says, but there's another way in which I can talk about a mental state. I could talk about, for example, the phenomenological account of what that thing is like. And he just says, well, the phenomenological side of this is the what it is like to be in a particular mental state. It's like the subjective feeling of being in that mental state. So, for example, while my central nervous system might be doing something during the fight or flight response, there is also what it feels like to have my central nervous system doing that. That is the feeling of being frightened. On the other hand, my brain might be sending various signals around in order to create a perception, but there is also the sensation of what it is like to perceive the colour red. Like I say, my personal subjective experience, the qualitative experience of what it is to perceive red, what it actually feels like, if you want to kind of call it that. So he then says, well, here we've got another way of explaining the old mind-body problem. He says we can talk about what we call the easy problem of consciousness. That is, how can a physical system carry out various mental states? So if we take something like memory, the idea would be, how could any physical system whether or not it's a human body or a computer or a plant or a cat or an alien, how could any physical system carry out the role of memory? So how would it retain information? We could explain that in terms of the brain. We can explain that in terms of whatever physical attributes the being that we're talking about has, the plant has. And then we explain the functions of those various parts, what kind of job they do in the overall economy of the organism, to try and show how you end up with memory. He says that's the easy problem of consciousness, because we do that all the time. We explain that in psychology as a science all the time, and in cognitive sciences. However, he says there's what we call the hard problem of consciousness. And while this isn't on the actual PowerPoint here, he uses the wonderful phrase, the question of how it is that the water of the brain creates the wine of consciousness. So his point is, how and why are psychological states and properties accompanied by phenomenal experiences? That is, why is it that a bunch of physical changes to my brain and a bunch of physical changes within my body, my organs and, the movement of my arms and things like that, why is it that that is accompanied by the feeling of fear or the feeling of happiness or a sensation of redness or a sensation of pleasure or of pain? You could imagine a world where all the physical processes and all the functions that we live in are carried out as they are now, and things would continue to go as they do, but without us having the phenomenal side of it, the what it feels like to be in that mental state, or at least Chalmers thinks so. The point that Chalmers is really trying to make here, and I think this is a really good way to kind of view this, is that we end up always with an explanatory gap, and we're going to come back to that in the future. There's an explanatory gap in our account of the mind as far as he's concerned, where we're happy to talk about the brain and we're happy to talk about the functioning of various organs and parts of ourselves, but those accounts always miss something out. What they miss out is the fact that there are these experiences which seem very central to talking about what it is to have a mind, and yet just talking about the brain doesn't capture that. So if that's the case, philosophers have got to work with scientists, have got to work with psychologists to try and work out why is it and how is it that changes in a physical structure could actually produce something as rich and deep as consciousness. So just to round this off, what I could say is, from that discussion of the hard problem of consciousness and all that sort of stuff, we can say that I can be in a particular mental state. But that mental state, what makes it a mental state, will be the fact that it has certain properties that physical states don't. Think about what Chalmers was just saying. Just because your brain's doing something, that doesn't explain why it is that there is a feeling that accompanies it or a sense which accompanies it. Why isn't it just a bunch of physical processes without consciousness? Well, that seems to suggest that there are some properties which can't be reduced down to just the physical. So a property is a feature or a quality of something. So if we're talking about physical properties, we might be talking about things like solidity or movement or density, size, shape. You could even kind of take this a step further and say being made of neurons is a property, or being a neuron is a property of a substance. Of being organic might be something, rather than synthetic, is a property of something. So how do you have a bunch of physical properties that then lead to mental properties? Likewise, we can have what we call functional properties. Now, a functional property won't be described in terms of what it physically is, so it's solid or it's dense or what it's made of. It will be the property of carrying out a certain role. So the role that's played by pain or the role that's played by a neuron. So if you imagine, just to make it a little bit sci-fi, if you imagine you're able to replace individual neurons with special synthetic ones you know, for people who've been in accidents, then that synthetic stuff that we make, you know, let's say silicon-based neuron that we make, isn't biologically a neuron. It's not made out of the carbon-based stuff that we are, but it plays the role of a neuron. So it has the functional property of being a neuron without actually being organically one of those things. I can explain all the physical and functional, but what properties make something mental and not just physical or functional? Well, this is where we get into next week. Is I've left that out because I'm saying, well, that's our first big discussion. We know what our physical properties are. We know what our functional properties are. But what are the mental properties that really act as the mark of the mental, that are the things which are not really meant to be reducible down to the physical or the functional in the kind of discussion that Chalmers is looking at? And basically, for the rest of the course, what we're effectively doing is looking at those mental properties and saying, well, hang on, could they just be physical? Could they just be functional? Or could they just be a big old myth that we could just ignore entirely? That's the direction that the course is going in. So from today, what we're interested in is what properties determine what is classed as the mental. So what set of properties or what property could I locate which would delineate the mental, separate it off from the physical, so that I could say, here are my physical qualities, you know, I'm this tall, I weigh this much, and here are my particular mental qualities, I have consciousness, this, that, and the other. Or what properties does a mind have is another way to think of it. Like, if I had to talk about what kinds of properties the mind has that makes it different from the body, what would those properties be? How do mental properties then relate to the physical and the functional? It might be that when I point out those properties and say, well, these are the mental ones rather than the physical ones, they could actually just be physical or functional anyway. It could just be that they're a particular type of physical state or a particular type of functional property or something like that. And then, if anything at all, what do our folk psychology terms actually relate to? I mean, what is a belief? What is a feeling? What is a desire? Those are the kinds of things that we started with. Those are the questions that we were asking. We didn't have any answers. We were just throwing them out there to say, those are the questions that we will be asking. Next week, what we're going to be looking at is two potential candidates for what we call the mark of the mental. That at least some of our mental states have what we call intentional properties, or what's referred to as intentionality. And then at least some mental states have what we call phenomenal properties. That is what we're going to refer to as qualia. So those are going to be our two candidates for this. Thank you very much for listening. We will come back to this next week. I hope you're well, and see you soon.